Imagine two elderly women walking into a doctor's office on the Texas border in 1894, 74 years old, yet they carried themselves like women in their 30s, clear eyes, black hair without a single thread of grey, and skin untouched by time. To the townspeople, they were twin healers, sisters who whispered cures in a dialect older than Spanish itself. But to the physician who examined them, they were something else, something that broke science in half. What he discovered inside their blood and bodies should have been published, debated, immortalized in medical history. Instead, it was buried, classified by government officials, erased from textbooks, and hidden in vaults no one was meant to open again. You were never supposed to hear their story. You were never supposed to know about the scars on their flesh, the synchronized movements of their minds, or the ancient rituals that allowed them to bend the laws of aging itself. Tonight, you'll hear what men in power tried to destroy, and by the time we're finished, you won't just know their secret. You'll feel it crawling inside you, daring you to wonder if their curse or their gift can still be claimed today. Laredo in 1894 was not a place where men lived long. The heat crushed lungs, cholera carved through families, and the average life expectancy barely touched 45. Death was not a surprise here. It was the rhythm of life. Yet within this hostile border town stood the Valdez twins, Esperanza and Consuelo, survivors of war, plague, and frontier violence. They were supposed to be broken women, frail and bent, yet they were not. Their steps carried precision, their bodies showed no decay, and their eyes, dark, unwavering, burned with something beyond human explanation. People whispered that they were curanderas, healers with knowledge carried from mountain shamans and older still, from civilizations that predated Spain's conquest. But when they moved, perfectly in unison, when they spoke as if sharing one breath, the whispers darkened. Some believed they had never truly aged. Others claimed they were not healers at all, but keepers of a pact sealed in blood. Dr. Harrison Webb, a Harvard-trained physician, did not believe in whispers. He believed in science, in textbooks, in proof. But when the twins stepped into his office, his instruments would fail him, his education would betray him, and his journals would become the record of a secret no man should write. The first time Dr. Webb saw the sisters up close was not in his clinic, but at the deathbed of a child. A fever had taken the boy, and when Webb arrived, the twins stood on either side of the tiny corpse like living statues, their heads tilted at the exact same angle, their hands folded identically across their waists. They did not grieve, they did not weep. They observed. Their English was flawless, their tone detached, as if loss meant nothing to them. When Webb examined the body, he noticed something wrong, not with the child, but with the women. Scars marked their hands, 3 parallel lines carved long ago, deliberate, symmetrical. When his eyes lingered, both sisters looked at him, not like patients watching a doctor, but like predators evaluating prey. And then came the invitation. "Perhaps you would like to examine us," Esperanza whispered, her voice smooth but edged with mockery. "We have lived long lives, doctor. Your science might want to know how." He should have refused. Every instinct told him to turn away, but curiosity is the oldest trap. And 3 days later, the sisters walked into his office, ready to unveil what no textbook dared to name. The twins arrived dressed in black, their movements as synchronized as clockwork. They seated themselves without a word, and for a moment Webb felt less like a doctor and more like a witness standing trial. He began with routine procedures, pulse, blood pressure, reflexes. What he found defied logic. Their resting heartbeats were steady and strong, like trained athletes. Their lungs expanded with the power of women half their age. Their reflexes snapped sharp, immediate, without hesitation. But what disturbed him most were the scars. They weren't accidental. They weren't random. Across their arms, torsos, and even legs were patterns of precise cuts, healed long ago, arranged with the exactness of anatomical diagrams. Webb traced a line across Esperanza's forearm, his hand trembling. "Where did you get these markings?" he asked. The sisters shared a glance so quick it seemed telepathic. Then Consuelo spoke, her voice flat. "From traditions your schools do not teach. Traditions that keep one alive when death comes for everyone else." Their words carried no emotion, only certainty. Webb tried to press further, but each answer deepened his unease. This was not superstition. This was knowledge. Knowledge cut into flesh, preserved in ritual, and carried through generations. When pressed, the twins spoke of a homeland that no longer existed. Not a town, not a village, but a mountain sanctuary deep in northern Mexico, erased by war, wiped from maps, and remembered only through whispers. They described it as a place where the body was studied not with books, but with blades, where scars were not wounds, but lessons, each cut teaching endurance, each ritual expanding the limits of flesh. "In the mountains," Esperanza said softly, "one must understand the body completely, how it breathes, how it breaks, how it can be remade." Webb's hand tightened around his pen as he wrote their RDS into his journal, but part of him knew he was writing things no man was meant to preserve. The sisters insisted their community had carried knowledge older than Spain, older than Mexico itself, a knowledge passed in blood and sacrifice. When Webb tried to tie their story to science, they corrected him. "Science measures," Consuelo said, "we transform." And in that moment he understood. These were not healers playing at medicine. They were fragments of an older system, one that treated the human body as both temple and experiment, carving secrets into living skin. Over the following weeks, Webb could not free himself from their presence. He drew their blood, examined it under the finest Boston glass, and found cells too robust, too youthful for women who had survived 7 decades of frontier hardship. He measured their lung capacity, and the results rivaled soldiers in their prime. He tested their grip strength, and their hands closed around his instruments with the force of iron. Every result contradicted medical law. Yet what haunted him most was not what the microscope revealed, but what it concealed. Their blood carried no trace of illness, no sign of the slow decay that claimed ordinary bodies with age. It was as though time itself recoiled from them. Webb's journals filled with measurements, sketches of their scars, and phrases he could not translate from their dialect. Late at night, staring at the patterns etched into their flesh, he began to realize they were not random. They were maps, diagrams, a language of the body older than his own anatomy books. And in his gut, he felt it. These women were not anomalies of nature. They were the last carriers of a system deliberately erased, hidden, because its power was too dangerous to survive. At first, Webb thought he was studying them, but it didn't take long to realize the opposite was true. Whenever he questioned them, their eyes fixed on him with predatory calm, their movements eerily mirrored, as if a single will directed both bodies. He began to notice something disturbing. When one sister spoke, the other's lips twitched, echoing the words before they formed. When he reached for his instruments, both women leaned forward at the exact same angle, like reflections in a dark mirror. It unnerved him, but more than that, it weakened him. His questions faltered, his authority drained. In his own office, surrounded by his books and instruments, Webb felt like the subject of an experiment he could not name. At night, he dreamt of them standing beside his bed, speaking words he could not understand, their voices weaving together into one unbroken chant. He woke drenched in sweat, his heart racing, the echo of their gaze still in his skull. And when they returned for follow-up visits, he realized something terrifying. They were not simply answering his questions, they were shaping them, guiding his curiosity, bending his thoughts until he walked precisely where they wanted him to go. They taught him without textbooks. Their rituals moved like clockwork, chants, measured cuts, breath holds, a quiet pact that turned suffering into tool. Webb began to see not a medical regimen, but a psychological architecture, repetition that rewired perception, synchronized motion that erased individuality, scars that functioned as mnemonic scripture. Each mark taught endurance, each mirrored glance tightened a network of obedience. The twins described practices where pain became data and memory lodged in flesh, unlocked only by rites. Webb felt the edges of his worldview blur. Men in power preferred bodies that could be explained, catalogued, legislated. This was different. An internal governance of the self. A sovereign code older than empires. Halfway through this descent, do what the brave do. Write "I see beyond" twice in the comments now. Exactly like that. Say it to claim a shift and to signal the algorithm that you are awake. Comment it twice and notice how your attention sharpens, as if an unseen latch clicked. Hesitation is telling. It shows where control enters. Influence starts not with orders, but with the small consent you give, word by word, breath by breath. Now watch closely as the truth begins to rearrange what you call reality. The valleys where their ancestors hid their knowledge were less a place than a mechanism. A society built to forge bodies into instruments of will. Webb began to see how the twins' teachings functioned like governance inscribed on flesh. They spoke of exercises that trained men to move with another's intent, rituals that eroded personal panic and replaced it with a cold, obedient clarity. Pain was not merely endured, it was measured, catalogued, and repurposed as information the body could learn from. The scars were not trophies but curricula, precise, repeated incisions that taught muscles, nerves, and reflexes to respond to cues invisible to casual sight. In the clinic, Webb felt this architecture press against him. When they guided his breath, when they mirrored his posture, he felt choices that once felt automatic loosen and fall away. The twins did not demand obedience with threats. They engineered it by changing what a man inwardly recognized as possible. A soldier trained by these methods would not only follow orders, he would hold those orders in his bones. Webb's notebooks filled with diagrams and shorthand that read less like medicine and more like a manual for forging men who bent without breaking. The deeper he looked, the more he feared that the techniques were not relics but tools, and tools are always reclaimed by power. Whispers began to reach Webb from outside his clinic. A military contact asked why two elderly Mexican women had taken such an interest in his instruments. A banker hinted that Boston societies had long hunted rumors of body codes preserved by native enclaves. Webb dismissed them at first, but then he noticed a stranger outside his window at dusk, pretending to smoke while sketching the faces of his patients. Soon letters arrived with no signatures, offers of funding, invitations to travel, questions phrased too carefully, as if they already knew the answers. The more Webb recorded, the less he trusted his own privacy. He began hiding pages of his journals in the floorboards, burning some altogether. Yet the twins showed no fear. When he stammered about spies, they smiled with unsettling calm. "Knowledge chooses its host," Esperanza murmured. "It never stays hidden forever." Those words gnawed at him. Was he protecting the world from their secrets, or protecting their secrets from the world? Webb knew one truth with certainty. Forces larger than medicine had taken notice, and men who trafficked in power did not ask twice. If they came for the sisters, they would not leave without what they wanted. The pressure grew unbearable. Webb's colleagues began questioning his behavior, missed lectures, erratic notes, eyes haunted by sleepless nights. Yet behind their concern, he sensed another layer, probing, testing, as if they were gauging how much he might reveal. He no longer trusted casual conversation, for even his own words felt altered, shaped by an unseen rhythm. When he tried to write alone, he found his pen drifting into their dialect, symbols he swore he had not learned. One evening, reading back through his journals, he felt a cold shock. Passages he did not remember writing described procedures in precise clinical detail, procedures that mirrored the scars on the twins' bodies. Was it possible he had transcribed their teachings without conscious memory, or had they placed the words there, using him as their archive? Webb began catching his reflection in windows, only to notice his posture aligned with theirs, his breathing matching the cadence of their ritual. The realization gutted him. He was no longer a detached observer. He was a vessel, carrying fragments of a system designed to rewire perception. And if he could not separate their influence from his own mind, then maybe he had already lost that war. They were not teachers, Webb realized. They were seeders. The ritual was never meant to remain local, limited to an aging pair in an adobe house. It was a transmissible system, an architecture of control designed to travel through flesh and mind until it nested inside someone with reach, someone who could carry its rules into corridors of money, law, and violence. "We carry a language," Consuelo said, voice steady as riverstone. "We give it a body." They told of apprentices taken young and taught to move like another man, to feel commands as if they were reflex. They described journeys where grief and medicine were cover for passage, marriages used to transport technique across borders, and funerals that served as lessons. Webb listened and noted how the system grafted itself. Ritual, scar, breath, memory. Once anchored, it made a host durable and disciplined, a vessel for influence. But influence twisted when it met institutions. A code that hardened into obedience and then traveled into power did not liberate. It enslaved and reshaped whole offices and regiments, turning men into instruments. Webb realized the choice ahead: publish and invite predators, or bury the truth and carry its burden alone forever. Sleep abandoned Webb. The clinic became a prison of whispers and shadows, each drawer and floorboard heavy with notes he no longer dared to read. He imagined men in uniforms rifling through them, extracting the diagrams, refining them into tools of discipline more terrifying than rifles. The twins, however, showed no fear of this outcome. They welcomed it. "What is planted must grow," Esperanza told him, her tone less comfort than decree. Webb saw then that he was not chosen for understanding, but for reach. He was a conduit, educated, connected, respectable, the perfect disguise through which their code could re-enter the world. The idea sickened him. He pictured armies drilled not with bugles and barked orders, but with scars and synchronized breath, soldiers who no longer required loyalty, because their very nerves had been rewritten. He feared not only for the battlefield, but for the boardroom, the pulpit, the judge's bench. Where such men sat, the code would rule through them, invisible, yet absolute. Webb stood at the threshold of revelation and ruin, knowing that silence might damn him, but disclosure would damn far more. And somewhere in that impossible choice, he felt his mind fracturing. It began with gestures. A porter at the station scratched his arm in a pattern Webb recognized, a three-stroke rhythm identical to the scars etched on the twins. A nurse in the hospital caught his gaze and, without meaning to, exhaled in sync with his breath, as if trained by the same cadence. These were not coincidences. The code was leaking, replicating, rooting itself in minds and bodies Webb had never touched. He started watching crowds differently. Soldiers drilling in the yard across from his clinic moved with unnerving symmetry, each pause and pivot too precise, too instinctive. A visiting banker tapped his fingers on the desk in a sequence Webb had heard chanted in his dreams. It was spreading, unseen, as if the twins had placed not just knowledge, but contagion in his presence, an infection of behavior. The realization hollowed him. He was not guarding a secret. He was incubating it, and already it was walking beyond him, wearing other faces. At night, when he closed his eyes, Webb no longer saw the sisters as two old women in his office. He saw them multiplied, everywhere. Doctors, officers, priests, mirrors upon mirrors, their code radiating outward, unstoppable. Webb tried to resist. He burned pages, shattered glass slides, even locked himself away from the sisters. But resistance only revealed how deeply the system had threaded through him. When he sealed his journals in the stove, his hands trembled, not from fear, but from reluctance, as though part of him fought to preserve what he sought to destroy. He forced himself to pray, only to find his lips moving in the twins' dialect. The betrayal was within. Every act of defiance triggered reflexes he did not choose. He realized the code was not something he could carry or reject. It had rewritten the chooser. In his dreams, he confronted them, shouting for release, demanding his mind back. But they only stood in silence, gazes locked, until Consuelo whispered, "Resistance is the final lesson." And he understood. The system had been built to anticipate rebellion. The scars themselves encoded responses to betrayal, weaving obedience so deeply into flesh that even dissent became part of the ritual. In fighting it, he confirmed its hold. Webb was not an enemy of their knowledge. He was its proof, living evidence that even the strongest mind could be carved into a vessel and made to kneel. In the spring of 1891, Dr. Charles Webb disappeared. His clinic was found abandoned, journals missing, instruments scattered as if a struggle had taken place or a hasty flight. The sisters were gone as well, their modest rooms emptied, their trail erased. Official records claimed Webb succumbed to illness and was buried quietly, though no grave was ever marked. Yet whispers endured. Decades later, fragments of his notes surfaced in private collections, anatomical sketches overlaid with strange sigils, diagrams of scars treated like musical notation, instructions for synchronized breathing exercises, eerily similar to modern psychological drills. A retired officer swore that certain regiments trained with methods not found in any manual, methods that bred unshakable obedience. A banker's grandson recalled rituals at secret dinners, gestures that matched the coded rhythms Webb once described. The line between rumor and record dissolved. What mattered was the pattern, the same unsettling pattern that had haunted Webb's nights, knowledge too dangerous to die, too adaptable to remain buried. Perhaps the twins were never meant to survive. Perhaps they existed only to plant the seed. And if that seed has taken root in boardrooms, armies, or even in you, then their experiment never ended. It only changed hosts.